Friends, in our passage today from Luke chapter 6, 39 to 49, we find Jesus offering a series of profound, almost poetic images, the blind leading the blind, the speck and the log, and the house built on rock versus sand. These images speak to universal human experiences that go across cultures and different religions, offering us wisdom which can resonate with all people who seek to live with integrity, with compassion, and with purpose in life. In the first image of the blind leading the blind, Jesus asks, can a blind person guide or lead a blind person? Will not both fall into a pit? And this image invites us to reflect on the nature of leadership and guidance in our lives. It's not about physical blindness, but about spiritual blindness and moral sight, about insight and the lack of insight. Who do we follow? What values and truths guide us? Are those that we follow trustworthy? In our fragile and often chaotic world, it's easy to follow voices that echo our fears and that flatter our egos. But real wisdom, true insight, comes not from superficial understanding, but from a deep reflection and self-awareness. And this is why in many traditions, from Christianity to Buddhism, the call is to wake up, to become conscious of our inner life so that we can see the outer world more clearly. There's something about this image that I believe speaks deeply into our non-subscribing tradition. In the constitution of our church, as it's framed in 1910, we are reminded of the sacred right of private judgment that God has given each of us, and that free inquiry is essential to the extension of religious knowledge. Ours is a constitution, therefore, that does not require blind faith. Echoing the warning of Jesus of the dangers of the blind leading the blind, ours is a tradition that invites every person to weigh and test everything for ourselves, so that each of us follows the dictates of our own conscience. When we are asked or pressured to override the dictates of our own conscience, and that sacred right of private judgment, then we are in danger of falling into a trap. We also fall into a similar trap when we do not test our own consciences as well. And so it doesn't necessarily mean that the dictates of our conscience are always correct. Our non-subscribing forebears were indeed right to emphasize the fact that God does and can and does speak through our own consciences. But even this requires discernment, because sometimes our consciences can be informed more by the dictates of the culture we grew up in or some authority figure in our lives that may or may not have been right or wrong than the voice of God. But equally, it needs to be said that when we fail to listen to the voice of conscience within, we are in danger of falling into the trap of an empty and a blind faith that leads not to inner integrity of heart, but to falling into a pit ultimately of meaninglessness, out of touch with our own inner sense of what is right and true, out of touch with our own inner sense of meaning and purpose in life. And so ours is not meant to be a blind faith, where we blindly follow what we are told or have been told, whether it's from a minister or someone else in authority. The faith of a non-subscriber should require that we be willing to put everything to the test in order to discover for ourselves what we believe with all our hearts to be true. The second image that Jesus refers to in this passage is the metaphor of the speck and the log. When Jesus says to his disciples, "Why do you see the speck in your neighbor's eye, but do not notice the log in your own eye?" And this teaching follows on naturally from the point that has just been made. It's a kind of a counterbalance, inviting us to question not just others, but also ourselves. It points to the very human tendency to judge others while being blind to our own faults. This is a universal experience. We spot the flaws in others far more easily than we see them in ourselves. And one of the ways we do this is by comparing our own strengths to another person's weaknesses, while being blind to our own weaknesses and failing to acknowledge fully the other person's strengths. But Jesus calls us to a deeper honesty, to look inward before we look outward. This isn't about harsh self-criticism. It's about humility and honesty. It echoes, interestingly, the Buddhist idea of right view, seeing ourselves and others without distortion. In the Buddha's Eightfold Path, which is essentially the path to living a noble life, in which we minimize suffering for ourselves and others, the first step on the Eightfold Path is what the Buddha called right view. If you have a distorted view of life, filled with misinformation, then it's going to cause all sorts of problems for ourselves and others, causing all sorts of suffering. But if we have a clear view of life, seeing life as it is and not as we think it should be, seeing ourselves as we are, not as we imagine ourselves to be through rose-tinted glasses, then we are able to navigate through life with greater wisdom. The rest of the Buddha's Eightfold Path flows from right view, which is the first one. If we have a right view, then the others begin to flow quite naturally. Right thought, right speech, right conduct, right livelihood, right effort, right attention, and right balance of mind. For Jesus in Luke's Gospel, having a clear view of life requires being deeply aware of our own foibles, our own weaknesses, and even the very human tendency towards self-deception. And this is about having a deep honesty and deep self-awareness of both our strengths and weaknesses, which enables us to have a clearer sense of the strengths and weaknesses of others. And to this end, Jesus tells a parable later on in Luke's Gospel, and I've mentioned it before recently, where he tells of a respectable and self-righteous Pharisee who pats himself on the back for being such a good person as he prays. And then the parable contrasts this respectable Pharisee with a despised and morally compromised tax collector who has become aware of his own failings and simply prays, "God, be merciful to me, a sinner." The parable that suggests as soon as we start thinking of ourselves as morally superior to another, we are on dangerous spiritual territory. As soon as we start wondering why other people are not like me, it might be a warning to look inward once again and to see what failing or weakness I may have missed or forgotten in myself. When we acknowledge our own imperfections, we become more compassionate toward the struggles of others. We recognize that we're all walking this difficult path of being human together. The words of Rumi speak deeply into this truth. He says, "Yesterday I was clever, so I wanted to change the world. Today I'm wise, so I'm changing myself." And in a related quote that maybe turns this thing around, Bryant McGill says, "You will be a beautiful person as long as you see the beauty in others." Finally, Jesus speaks of building a house with strong foundations. It's a simple but powerful metaphor. Life will bring storms, and this is certain. Pain, loss, confusion, these are all inevitable. But the strength of our inner life, the depth of our values, and our connection to a deeper wisdom determines whether we stand firm or fall. To build on rock means to live with integrity, not just to hear the call to compassion, to justice and love, but to actually live it. It's about aligning our actions with our inner truths. Building a house with strong foundations is about building lives also not on things that are temporary and fleeting in nature, what the New Testament generally calls this world. In other words, the outer world of form. If our trust is ultimately in the outward world of form, which is constantly shifting and changing, then we will ultimately have no real rest for our souls. To build on a solid foundation, we have to move beyond the world of form to that which is formless and unchanging, the deeper inner realm of the spirit. Our non-subscribing forebears tended to emphasize deeds over creeds. So what does it mean to live these teachings today? It might mean pausing before rushing to judgment, asking, what's the log in my own eye? It might mean questioning the voices we follow, whether political, religious, or personal, and asking, do they lead with wisdom and compassion, or are we blindly following? And it also means returning to our foundations. What are the core values that we build our lives on? Are they sturdy enough to hold us when life gets hard? What might it mean to trust in the deeper and higher wisdom of the divine, of God, that's rooted not in this world of outward form, but in the unseen inner realm of the spirit? May each of us take that step today toward greater awareness, greater compassion and wisdom, and a life built on the solid ground of a deeper truth and a wider love. Amen. God bless.